Thank you for inviting me back to give yet another lecture in this series. How many of you have been here for at least some of the previous lectures? A faithful crowd. Wow. Thank you so much. This is, by my count, the 6th lecture in the series that I've been giving on the historical reliability of the Gospels. We began with a lecture on who wrote the Gospels. Then we had one on the external evidence for the truth of the Gospels, one on the internal evidence for the truth of the Gospels. We paused and seized the occasion of Easter to give a talk on the resurrection, and then the last 2 talks were on alleged historical errors, external evidence that some have tried to say indicates errors in the Gospels. And now we're moving on to alleged contradictions in the Gospels, alleged internal problems. So that's the focus of tonight's lecture. I hope you've all picked up the handout, which was being distributed there by John. John, do we have a few left? Anybody not have one and want one? Yep, we got somebody up here. All right, good. And with that, we will commence. As usual, I have a scripture verse to act as the epigraph or the motto for this talk. I chose, after some thought, 2 Peter 3:16. There are some things in them, Peter is talking about the letters of Paul, that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. Those are strong words, but Peter is indicating that there are people who take things that Paul has written, and indeed other scriptures, and either through ignorance or through malice, they twist them and create problems or heresies where they weren't there originally. Let's see what that means for us. For those of you who have been following this series, I've got a little map of the material breaking it down into external and internal matters, and then the other direction into positive evidence and objections. Tonight, we are here in the 4th quadrant of that. We've dealt with the positive evidence from non-Christian sources and from incidental confirmations. We've dealt with the internal evidence of undesigned coincidence and other kinds of internal clues. We've dealt at some length with alleged historical errors in the Gospels, and now it's time for us to deal with alleged contradictions between the Gospels. A couple of months ago, I had breakfast with a group of men in a nearby town who were thinking of having me come out and give some talks at their church. And we ate breakfast and chatted about other things for a while. And eventually they said, well, we got about half an hour left. Why don't you tell us what you're all about? Which is kind of a broad topic. But I said to them, thinking fast, let me tell you what your kids and the young people in your church are going to hear about the Bible when they get to college. And then for the next 10 minutes, I started ripping into the Gospels. There's this historical error, this geographical error, this problem, that problem, the other problem. And I laid out a whole array of criticisms of the Gospels. When I stopped, the blood had drained out of their faces, and one of the guys sort of stammered and said to me, you make that sound really plausible. And I said, well, of course. College professors are intelligent people on the whole, with some exceptions. And, of course, they're going to make it sound really plausible. And what are your kids going to say? Or the kids in your church, what are they going to say? Right? I go to church, and my Sunday school teacher or my pastor, who has that job because they believe in these things, says I can trust the Bible. And then I go to college, and my professor, who has that job because my professor is really smart and knows a lot of stuff, tells me that's a bunch of baloney. Who should I believe? I said the very best outcome you can hope for is that they'll come away saying, well, I don't know what to believe now. And usually the outcome is not going to be that good. Since we've been spending so much time on objections in the past few lectures, and we're doing that again, this one and presumably a next one as well, I want to back up. I want to give you the big picture because it's easy to make certain mistakes about answering objections and thinking about objections to Christianity. First thing I want to say is the Bible is a big book. It's a wide surface area. You've got 66 different books written by 30 or 40 some authors over a period of well over 10 centuries. There are going to be lots of places where somebody can raise an objection. The objection may have a perfectly good answer, but it's a wide surface area. It's a big target. So lots and lots of objections are out there. And sometimes all of us will encounter questions that we don't at the moment know how to answer. That's not because the Bible is a bunch of hokum. It's because it's such a large subject and none of us knows everything there is to know about it. And the more you know about it, the more you know how hard it is to know everything that there is to know. Now, there's nothing wrong with attempting to answer, to the best of our ability, difficult questions regarding Scripture. And we've been doing that. We're going to continue to do it. But I want to warn you against a particular kind of error. The Oxford logician Richard Whately in the 19th century called this the fallacy of objections. And here's what he says about it. It's easy to get fixated on some particular objection that we cannot at present answer in a fully satisfactory way. Oh, I ran into an objection about Scripture. What shall I do? But the question is not, am I omniscient? Can I answer all questions? The question is, which side has the greater difficulties? Christianity or its denial? What I would submit to you is that it requires more faith, in a sense of that term, to be a consistent atheist than it does to be a Christian. And in order to establish that claim, I've taken some time in early lectures in this series to lay out some of the positive evidence so that it wouldn't seem that I was simply saying, yay, I'm a Christian, I feel good about Christianity, you should all feel good about Christianity too. Instead, I've given you historical reasons of the kind you can check up yourself, of the kind that we use in secular historical work to take these documents seriously. Well, not everyone agrees. Isn't that shocking? Here's Christopher Hitchens, lately deceased, telling us just what he thinks about the New Testament. He says it is a work of crude carpentry hammered together long after its purported events and full of improvised attempts to make things come out right. And I think he believes it. Putting a little bit more point on it for our purposes, here's Bart Ehrman, one-time pastor, now an apostate, who says the sources, he means the sources regarding Jesus' resurrection, which for our main sources would mean the gospel accounts, are hopelessly contradictory, as we can see by doing a detailed comparison of the accounts in the Gospels. And he's very fond of this in debates. He stands up and rattles off a list of things that he considers to be hopelessly contradictory, and there challenges his opponents to try to address the grocery list of objections he's just given. Now, I want to be very clear about our goals tonight so that you understand what we are going to try to accomplish and what we are not going to try to accomplish. First, I want to understand the difference between a real contradiction and an apparent contradiction. There are lots of apparent contradictions. The question is, are they real? So we'll go into definition on that point. Second, we need to explore some of the methods that historians use to assess apparent contradictions in secular historical work, identifying some common sources of apparent contradictions that can in fact be resolved. Next, to examine in the light of those methods, the methods that we would use in other historical work, a few of the most common charges of contradiction among the Gospels. And finally, to assess the accusation that the Gospels are, to use Bart Ehrman's words, hopelessly contradictory. Those are our goals. There are also some things we will not do tonight. We will not prove or even attempt to prove that the Bible is inspired or that it is inerrant. This discussion right now is aimed at people who want to know what can be said purely on the basis of historical methods, and historical research cannot establish the inspiration or the inerrancy of Scripture. It can clear the ground for the consideration of those issues, but historical method alone is not able to establish those things. We will not try to resolve all of the alleged contradictions among the Gospels. If this disappoints you, or if your favorite alleged contradictions don't get discussed tonight, come back next time. We will focus next time on the death, burial, and resurrection narratives, where many people think the worst contradictions are congregated. So if you're thinking of something there, we'll come back. We'll talk about those things next time. But why not try in one lecture to resolve all of the contradictions? Tell me, how long do you want to be here? Here's a chart, you can find it on the internet, of 439 alleged contradictions in the Bible. Got a few hours to hear me go through all 439 of them? No, I didn't think so. Now, this chart is an eye-catching piece of propaganda. I don't know how well you can see it from here, but there are little red arcs connecting a chapter of the Bible at one point and a chapter of the Bible at another point. And then down below are listed all of the contradictions. It's a beautiful piece of graphic design. As a contribution to the discussion, it's completely bogus. I don't think I have ever said, and I read these things for fun. 194 contradictions in the New Testament. I'm there. I got downloading the document, I'm reading it, I'm making notes. Most of these are so bad that if I were to waste your time presenting them, you'd laugh at me and you'd say, why would anybody even think of that? I mean, there's literally one where they cite a passage where the Bible says that God does not sleep, and then they cite a psalm that says, "Awake, O Lord, why do you sleep?" Do you think that's a metaphor? But, they left no stone unturned in the attempt to find something to fill out their chart, because if they had only had 7 or 8 lines going back and forth, it wouldn't look nearly as cool as having 439 of them. However, we're going to try, for the most part, to stick to the better ones, although 1 or 2 of the ones we're going to do tonight, you may still hook an eyebrow at me and say, why did you even bother with that one? But I bothered because it's out there, and they do bother people. To start with, let's get an example of an actual contradiction. And in order not to bias the discussion, let's take it from somewhere outside of the Bible altogether. I'm going to go for recent events. Last month, news outlets reported that the legendary science fiction author Ray Bradbury, author of Fahrenheit 451 and other works, had died. So here's one of the reports, pulled off the internet. My friend Steve Hayes compiled this little list, and I am indebted to him for it. Legendary science fiction author Ray Bradbury passed away Wednesday morning in Los Angeles. That seems pretty straightforward. Let's look at another one. Bradbury's daughter confirmed his death to the Associated Press on Wednesday morning. She said her father died Tuesday night in Southern California. Let's get another one. Bradbury died Tuesday night in Los Angeles. His agent, Michael Condon, confirmed. Do you see the problem? Tuesday and Wednesday are different days. So, what should we say? We should distinguish here, and all historians do this, between the big picture and the details. They differ regarding the day of Bradbury's death. Was it Tuesday? Was it Wednesday? One of them gives a less specific location for his death than the other two, Southern California versus Los Angeles. But they all agree on the main point. Ray Bradbury has just died. In fact, they all confirm that point, notwithstanding the actual contradiction between the Tuesday and the Wednesday claim and the variation between the general location and the more specific location. Those minor divergences don't undermine the main point. As historians look at this sort of thing, that's what they look for. So in secular historical work, scholars expect that independent accounts will have apparent and sometimes even real contradictions in many of the details. Such discrepancies do not affect the overall picture unless, and this is the key point, unless the contradictions are real and are so extensive that they undermine the credibility of all of our sources. That would be a problem. That's how historians approach their texts. Little differences of detail, no biggie. Maybe a real contradiction, maybe only an assumed one. Well, let's get that distinction clear first. A contradiction. Two claims contradict one another, really contradict one another, when one of them must be false if the other is true. At least one of the two claims must be mistaken. This is one of the reasons why throwing Bible contradictions at people is such a common and attractive way of trying to undermine the reliability of Scripture. You don't need to know anything about ancient history. You don't need to know anything about Greek or Jewish or Roman civilization or customs. All that you have to do is open up the Bible in one verse and then open it up to a different verse. Oh, well, that doesn't seem to match up. But we need another definition here. Apparent contradiction. Two claims apparently contradict one another when it seems that they cannot both be true. But that leaves open the question, do they just seem to contradict one another, or do they really contradict one another? There are 5 sources that we're going to see illustrated tonight. There are more than these 5, but these 5 kind of jumped out at me as I was preparing the talk. 5 sources of apparent contradiction that isn't real. Source number 1, carelessness. Interpreting a phrase or a sentence without regard to the genre of the work or just the narrative context, right? Read around, see what else is said in the passage. That kind of carelessness is by far the most common source of apparent contradictions. That chart is full of cases where a little attention to what you're reading, a little thought about the genre would have taken care of the apparent contradiction. Completeness, oddly enough, is another one. The assumption that every account of an event includes every significant detail about it. The more historical work you do, the more you realize that is just not true. And then, if one account mentions some detail and another account doesn't, you won't be tricked into thinking, oh, well then it must not really have happened because somebody else doesn't mention it. That kind of argument from silence is one of the worst and most overused moves in destructive biblical criticism. I've gone on a rant about that before. If you need more of the rant, ask me about it after we're done here, and I'll be happy to use up 5 or 10 minutes of your time just listing cases where the argument from silence crashes and burns. A third source of apparent contradiction, conflation, treating two different events or persons as if they were the same. We'll see illustrations of this. Another one is the opposite error of confusion. Confusion, treating the same event or person as different. This happens a lot with names where somebody will have 2 different names and people will assume, oh, that's 2 different people. We'll see an example of that as we go on. And finally, context. And here I mean wide context, cultural and linguistic context, ignoring facts about the language and culture of the events or assuming that those are identical to the cultural context that we all share today. That is a source of apparent contradiction. Let's look at one more apparent contradiction from outside of Scripture before we move into the discussion of apparent contradictions in the Gospels. Here's one. Who made the public proclamation of the Declaration of Independence from the balcony of the Old State House in Boston on the morning of July 18th, 1776? You'd think that we could nail that one down. Well, if you start running back through the primary sources, you find something interesting. Some of the sources say that it was William Greenleaf. He was the sheriff in that county. He would have had the right to read it. Some of the sources say he did. Other early sources, just as early, and quite a few of them, say that it was Colonel Thomas Crafts. What should we say? It's an apparent contradiction. But it's resolved by further information. Actually, both Greenleaf and Crafts read the declaration from the balcony on that day. Greenleaf had a weak voice. He began to read it. And the people in the crowd assembled below were making so much noise. They were a little rowdy. They wanted to hear this. It's louder. We can't hear you. And so, Colonel Crafts, who had a booming voice, came up. And as Greenleaf read a sentence at a time, Crafts turned around and repeated the sentence in an enormous voice so that everyone could hear it. So, what causes us at first to say, oh, well, that appears to be a contradiction? It's the assumption, unstated, that it could not have been both. But it was, and further information helps us to see that. So, the appearance of contradiction arises because most of us lack a key piece of information about the context. With that piece of information, oh, Greenleaf had a weak voice. They were speaking to a large crowd. Crafts was on hand and was willing to repeat it. Then we can see how all the pieces fit together. So much for that example. I'm going to give you one more. I want to give you two accounts of the life of Jonathan Edwards. How many of you have heard of Jonathan Edwards? Yay, great. Here are two accounts of the life of Jonathan Edwards. He was a minister and the son and grandson of a minister. Both accounts agree. He was precocious. Before he was 10 years old, he was famous for his intellectual attainments and his religious maturity. Both accounts agree. They say the same thing. He served for 2 years as a tutor at his college before accepting a pastoral position. Both accounts agree. The place where he got it was the place where his maternal grandmother had been a pastor. The accounts agree. Subsequently, though, he was dismissed from that position on account of a doctrinal dispute. The two accounts are perfectly in parallel. So he moved to a smaller church, and there he was well loved. Both accounts agree. While he was at this smaller church, he turned to scholarship. He produced several valuable works, and he struck up a voluminous correspondence with eminent scholars both at home and abroad. Both accounts agree. He was then called from this church to the presidency of a prominent college in the Northeast. Both accounts agree. On the first Sunday of the new year, after accepting that invitation to the presidency, he preached on Jeremiah 28:16, the verse, "This year thou shalt die." And although he was in apparently good health when he preached that sermon, he died later that year in his mid-50s. Both accounts agree. You're like, okay, both accounts agree. I get that. One more thing. One of the accounts says he died in 1758, and the other says he died in 1801. What? Nobody can die in his mid-50s, both in 1758 and in 1801, right? We've got a 43-year gap here. So it seems that one of these accounts must be wrong. Which account is wrong? Hold that thought. We'll come back to this one. All right, now for the meat of it. You've all been waiting for it. Let's just list some alleged contradictions in the Gospels. Again, no attempt to be comprehensive here. I'm just going to give you 7, and then we'll go through them one at a time. First one, Matthew and Luke present conflicting genealogies for Jesus. Number 2, Matthew claims that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, but Luke claims that Jesus was born during the census of Quirinius more than a decade later. Number 3, Matthew has Mary and Joseph living in a house in Bethlehem when Jesus was born, but Luke says they were living in Nazareth and traveled to Bethlehem for a census. I actually heard Michael Shermer try to push this kind of a line in a public debate once. Objection number 4, Matthew says Jesus had a disciple named Thaddeus, but he doesn't list Judas. Luke lists Judas, but not Thaddeus. What's up with that? Number 5, Matthew says that the centurion who had a sick servant, you remember that story, came to Jesus himself. But Luke says that he sent messengers instead of coming himself. Which way was it? Number 6, in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the cleansing of the temple comes at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, just after the miracle at Cana. But in the Synoptics, wrong way around. In the Synoptics, it comes at the end of his ministry. In John, it comes at the beginning. Which way? Beginning or end? And 7, Matthew says that Judas hanged himself, and the Jewish rulers bought a field with his money, the 30 pieces of silver that he flung back into the temple. We slip out of the Gospels here, but since Acts is really Luke part 2, I think it's fair. Luke, in the book of Acts, says that Judas bought a field and that he fell down and died. Well, which way was it? Now let's examine these one by one. Alleged contradiction number 1, the genealogies of Jesus. Matthew 1:16 says, "And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ." So it's pretty clear that Joseph was the son of Jacob, or at least that Jacob was an ancestor. Sometimes that father relation is a little more flexible. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Luke says Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli. Hold it. Joseph, we understand that Jesus is supposed to have been born of a virgin. That's fine. But Joseph was Mary's husband. He can't have had 2 different fathers, can he? So, was his father Jacob or was it Heli? What's going on with that? So, just to state the objection as clearly as possible, Matthew tells us that Joseph's father's name was Jacob. According to Luke, Joseph's father's name was Eli. The 2 genealogies diverge widely all the way back to David, 1,000 years earlier. So you try to line them up, and there's different names virtually everywhere, all the way back up to David. Now, there's an assumption that generates the appearance of contradiction here, and that is that both genealogies are meant to give the ancestry of Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father. But is that true? There are a couple of different points of view on this. I'm going to tell you mine, and if you hear something different from your pastor, that's fine too. I think that the assumption is just false, that the genealogy in Luke goes through Mary, not through Joseph. And the appearance of contradiction arises because of conflation. Remember those 5 sources of contradiction? We're thinking of these as trying to give us the same thing, and in fact they're giving us distinct things. There are 2 clues in the text. First of all, the Greek in Luke 3 does not say the son of Heli. It just says of Heli. The word son is not repeated after the first usage, but more importantly, that qualifying phrase, as was supposed, the place that appears in the text and the fact that there is no possessive definite article by it make it plain that Joseph isn't part of the lineal descent that's being given here. There's a parenthesis. In fact, there's a case where Herodotus uses almost the same Greek phrase and means who was supposed to have been the child of this person. And then the idea is that's not a mistake. He's not genetically, physically the child of this person. That may be so. And it may be that Eli or Heli, in that case, is Mary's father. But then that still doesn't answer all the questions. So let's go through some of the related complaints laid out against these genealogies. First, Luke gives many more generations than Matthew does for the part where the 2 run in parallel. Here's a quotation from Richard Dawkins, certainly no fan of the Gospels. "Do these people never open the book that they believe is the literal truth? Why don't they notice those glaring contradictions? Shouldn't a literalist worry about the fact that Matthew traces Joseph's descent from King David via 28 intermediate generations, while Luke has 41 generations?" That sounds interesting. 28 versus 41. What should we think about that? Well, Matthew does skip over some generations, but it is not required. that either genealogy should give each link always from father to son. Matthew's purpose is to establish Jesus' legal descent, not to give every step in the descent. In fact, look at the way that the first verse of the first chapter of Matthew sets it out. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He doesn't mean that David was Jesus' father in the father to son sense, and he doesn't mean that David was Abraham's child in the father to son sense. He's establishing ancestry. Why would that be important for Matthew? What would be the point that would make that something Matthew would want to stress? All through the Gospel of Matthew, in fact, leading up to the baptism of Jesus, even leading up to the Sermon on the Mount, virtually every paragraph is rounded off from a quotation from Old Testament prophecy saying, this was done that it might be fulfilled. Well, to whom were promises made of the coming of the Messiah? Abraham was a major figure to whom promises were given, and David, the sure mercies of David. Read the book of Acts sometime and pull out all those prophecies that they're always talking about in the sermons in Acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're all through it. And then go back and chase them down to their sources. It's very instructive. So Matthew is establishing Jesus is the heir to Abraham and to David, to whom the promises were given and in whom those promises are fulfilled. Oh, but we're not done complaining about it. Let's let our skeptics have another crack at it. Matthew counts the generations and comes up with 3 groups of 14. It's the latter 2 groups of 14 Dawkins is referring to when he says the 28 from David down. How can he be skipping generations if he's counting them? Now note the assumption built in here, right? The only purpose of counting the generations is to specify the total number of father to son links in the list. Is that assumption true? No. The purpose of Matthew's counting is not to specify the number. After all, anybody could count them. Rather, it's to break the list into 3 parts, setting 14 names in each, which he stresses. 14 names here, 14 names there, and 14 names in the other ones. But why would somebody do that? Well, the first thing to note is that we find something similar in that foundational text of the Jewish Kabbalah, the Zohar, where it says that all of the generations from Abraham to Solomon were 15, and that from Solomon to the captivity were also 15, and then it likens these to the days leading from a new moon to a full moon, and a full moon to a new moon again. So that is a Jewish trope. It's something that we find done. It may be done for easy memorization. It's easy to memorize lists that are broken up in symmetrical ways. But there's one other suggestion that's kind of cool. In Hebrew, the numerical value of the name David is Dalet Vav Dalet, is 4 plus 6 plus 4 is 14. So if you needed to try to remember this list, one of the clues could be, I'm going to remember 14 names that establish the descent of David, and then 14 names from David to the disaster, the deportation of the children of Israel into captivity, and then 14 names down to Jesus. 14. How do you remember that number? Because that's David. That's the numerical value. Jews love to play number games like this. The more you read around in the Jewish literature, the more of this you will see. I don't know for sure if that's the reason that 14 was the chosen number. It's a plausible conjecture. But we're not done complaining. Some people just don't know when to quit. How could they possibly have known their ancestry back so far? I heard an interview with the infamous John Shelby Spong, an apostate bishop. What the Apostle Paul would have said about him probably doesn't bear repeating in polite company. But Spong was sneering at the notion of the genealogies and said scoffingly, come on, how many of us, even in these modern days, can trace our genealogy back 5 generations? How many of you can go back 5 generations? okay? Because you've looked it up, right, on the internet. You know, it's hard to do. All right. But our culture is not their culture. Our priorities are not their priorities. To know the tribe from which one was descended was a matter of great importance to the Jews. If you were a Levite, you wanted maybe to execute the priestly office, you had to marry into the appropriate family. If you weren't a Levite, you weren't even allowed to come into certain places. So it was very important for them. But more than just saying it's very important, let's look at a non-Christian, Jewish, 1st century document, the autobiography of Flavius Josephus. He gives his own ancestry in the first chapter of his autobiography. And then he writes, "So I have set down the genealogy of our family as I have found it described in the public records to put an end to any would-be detractors." Now, what can that mean except that at the time he had access to the public records of his own genealogy, which means public records were kept. This was important to the Jews. Much more important than it would be to us. So the source of this complaint is ignorance of the cultural context of 1st century Judaism. We assume that they don't have any more importance attached to genealogy than we would if we were doing it. And because of that assumption, we think that it's implausible that the Jews could have traced back their ancestry like that. It's not implausible. But one actually has to understand their culture and not anachronistically assume that they are just like us in all respects. Moving on to alleged contradiction number 2, the date of Jesus' birth. Those of you who have come to some of the previous talks have actually got to jump on this one because you're going to recognize what I'm about to say. So I'll abbreviate it in order not to bore you. Matthew 2, verse 1 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king." Luke 2 starts out famously, and I'm just going to quote from the English Standard Version here, the ESV. "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria." Even the ESV gives a marginal note on that translation, but never mind, I'll get to that in a moment. So Matthew claims Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. But, so says our skeptic, Luke claims Jesus was born during the census of Quirinius. Herod died in 4 BC. The census of Quirinius took place a decade after that, in AD 6. Well, that can't be reconciled. But does Luke claim that? So, Cliff's Notes version. Luke notes that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. Luke 1:5 states that this is the beginning of the setting of the story as he's beginning to talk about John. He also knows about the taxation under Quirinius because Gamaliel mentions it in a speech that Luke quotes in the book of Acts. He doesn't claim, and for this I've given the argument elsewhere, he doesn't claim that the taxation under Quirinius took place in 6 BC or that Jesus was born during the taxation of Quirinius in AD 6. For details, you're going to have to see my previous lecture. It's up on YouTube. You can find it very easily, and I go into the details of the case there. Alleged contradiction number 3. Where were Mary and Joseph living? Matthew 2 says, now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, right? We just saw that. Matthew 2:11, talking about the coming of the wise men, the Magi, says, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. But Luke says, Joseph went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. In other words, he's coming from somewhere else. Is there a contradiction here? Ransacking the internet for people with complaints about the gospel, I ran across this one. Matthew 2, 1 through 12, 22, and 23 says Joseph was originally a resident of Bethlehem, whereas Luke 1, 26, 27, 56, 2, 4 through 5, and 39 says he was originally a resident of Nazareth. Really? Is that what Matthew says. No. Matthew never says that Joseph and Mary were living in Bethlehem already. The first time Bethlehem's even mentioned is as the place where Jesus is born. But there's then the Annunciation seen to Matthew before that, and there's nothing of this. Matthew doesn't mention a house until the wise men come. When Herod gets upset and sets out to kill the male children, what age limit does he set? 2, which in the Jewish manner of counting would be all of them who haven't passed their first birthday. What does that mean? Because he inquires diligently, Matthew tells us. What time did the star appear? When did you see it? Signaling the birth of the king. We're talking about a period that could be up to a year later here. So there is no assumption that this is the place that they had been all along, or even the place where Jesus was born. It's the place where he is when the wise men come, some period of time later. I understand that at Christmas time it's customary for us to pull out the shepherds and put them right there, right by the little creche in the stable, and then to pull out the wise men and put them at the same place. That's not what the text says. That's an attempt to put the two stories together in a way that they don't license. It makes a pretty panorama for Christmas, but actually those two events are quite distinct. The moral: it is important to read the text for oneself and not take someone else's word for what it says. Just because somebody says, "Oh, Matthew says X," don't assume that it's true. Check it out for yourself. But maybe this answer isn't fully satisfactory. Here's a complaint about it. If Mary and Joseph were living somewhere other than Bethlehem before Jesus was born, why didn't Matthew say so? Do you see the assumption that lies behind this? None of the Gospels professes to give a complete account of the life of Jesus. That assumption of completeness, that every record has to give us every detail about everything, is bogus. And we know this. The more historical research we do, the more clear this is to us. That wasn't their purpose. Note what John expressly says, John 20, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. And the signs Jesus did are a lot more important to the authors of the Gospels than the details of his birth. 2 of them give us some of those details. But even of the things that are very important that Jesus did, they're not written. Notice the assumption here, the complaint, it arises from a misplaced expectation of completeness. How about number 4? We're passing the halfway mark. So if you're getting tired, this is a good sign. Mark 3:18 lists Jesus' disciples. Andrew, he's gone on for a while about the big ones. And then Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, and then he goes on and finishes the list. But when we look at Luke 6:16 and we get a list, we find no Thaddeus. Instead we get Judas the son of James, who by that designation is distinguished from Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So the objection is, Mark says Thaddeus was a disciple, but Jesus, the son of James, was not, and Luke says the opposite. Is that a fair way of stating what really is going on? Does Mark say anything about Judas, son of James, by that designation? Does he say, oh, and by the way, Judas, son of James, some people thought he was a disciple, but not really? No, it doesn't say that at all. It just omits that as a name in the list. Same thing with Luke, the other direction. The answer is that it appears these are 2 names for the same person, and that's not at all uncommon. Think about it. If I say to you, Cephas, who do you think of? Peter, because that's the name we use more for him now. If I say Simon, that's also one of the names of Peter. How could one guy have 3 names? That was not uncommon in those times. So the assumption here that lies behind the objection is a confusion in which two names for the same person are mistaken for names of two different people. There's no reason to think that they must be just because the names differ. Now, what if we didn't have any information about the reliability of these authors of the Gospels? What if, for all we knew, these guys were just reporting third-hand rumors? They hadn't really been around when any of this happened. They hadn't talked to anybody who had been around when any of this happened. Then we might take more seriously the idea, hey, all right, maybe one of these guys is just mistaken. But that option is closed off for us by what we've seen in the first and the second and the third lecture. Some of you may have been here for those lectures and may have wondered, why doesn't Dr. McGrew give us a stirring defense of the divine inspiration of Scripture? He does believe in it. Why didn't he make that the focal point of his response? And the answer is so that when I got to this point, I could point you back to those first three lectures and say, there's not a scrap of argument that we have used that depends at any point on any theological conclusion. It has all been done purely historically. And because of that, I can unblushingly say today that we have already established the historical trustworthiness of these Gospels. Alleged contradiction number 5. Matthew tells the story of a centurion who appeals to Jesus to heal his servant. When he entered Capernaum, he being Jesus here, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him. But when we read about this in Luke 7, it says, when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. So, did the centurion come himself, or did he send others as messengers? There are two ways of dealing with this. I'm pretty comfortable with one of them, but I'll tell you what both of them are. One of them is it simply says, could have been both. He could have sent messengers before himself and then come along himself later. And that may be true. But if not, I think there's a perfectly good resolution anyway. In the world of the first century, and in fact, for some considerable time thereafter, it was very common to speak of someone's performing an action when the action was by his authority, or by his provision, or by his request. So Matthew speaks of the action as belonging to the centurion, the action of requesting that Jesus heal his servant, because he initiates it. And he speaks of Jesus speaking to the centurion through speaking to his messengers, which Luke details for us. Giving us that greater detail, Luke tells us that he sent the messages by means of others and that Jesus responded through them. But did I just make that up in order to get out of the problem? No. Let's illustrate this usage. Matthew 27, 59 and 60, telling us just after Jesus' crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Jesus and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. Does that verse mean that Joseph of Arimathea was a stonemason and that cutting tombs was his job? No, he was a rich man. He didn't do manual labor. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was someone who was respected for his knowledge of the law. He had caused the tomb to be cut out. He had commissioned it. He had taken care of it that way. Again, John 4, 1 and 2. John 4, 1 says, the Pharisees had heard Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. And then he goes in the very next verse and says, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. What is this? Did he baptize or didn't he? Yes, he baptized in the sense that it was in response to his preaching and under his authority that people were baptized. No, he didn't baptize in the sense of using his own hands to baptize the people. That's all there is to it. But it's considered to be the baptism of Jesus if it's done under his authority and in response to his preaching. In John, we see that come out very clearly But if John hadn't put that second phrase in, the cries and the complaints we would have heard from the critics. John says Jesus was baptizing people. We hear nothing of this from the other gospel authors. It's a simple matter of the cultural context. One more example of this in Luke chapter 7, verse 5, and this is the very passage we're talking about. So just to show that Luke also uses this kind of language and in this kind of context. When the Jewish leaders of the town come to Jesus and beseech him on behalf of the centurion, they try to convince Jesus he's worthy. And what they say is, he is worthy for you to do this thing for him because he has done many favors for our people. He built us this synagogue. The centurion built the synagogue? But he's a soldier. That's what it means to be a centurion. He's not a stonemason. Of course not. What it means is that he commissioned it. He paid for it. It was through his generosity that it was made. So this method of speaking, this kind of usage, is common throughout the Gospels themselves. The objection regarding the centurion, then, arises from missing part of the cultural and linguistic context. We'll come back to that issue one more time before we're done. Let's move on to alleged contradiction number 6. This is a big one. You'll hear a lot about this in New Testament studies. In John chapter 2, Jesus goes up to Jerusalem and he chases the money changers and the animal merchants out of the temple with a whip. And it's very clear in John that this is associated with the beginning of his ministry, because he's just done the miracle of turning the water to wine at Cana, and then very shortly after that goes up to Jerusalem to do this. But in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew and Mark and in Luke, Jesus chases the money changers and the animal merchants out of the temple at the end of his ministry. Now, are these two passages descriptions of the same event? It certainly sounds like it. After all, he's in Jerusalem, he's in the temple, he's angry with the money changers and the animal merchants, and he chases them out. That all sounds like the same event. I want to go back here to that curious case of Jonathan Edwards. You remember that? Remember all the things that the two accounts have in parallel, and then suddenly there's this chronological discrepancy where one says he dies in 1758, and the other that he dies in 1801. Now, nobody can die in his mid-50s in both of those years. So, what's wrong? Despite appearances, both accounts are perfectly true. How could that be? All the facts listed are true of two different men, father and son, both named Jonathan Edwards. All of those details are true of both of them. We're inclined to underestimate the extent to which different people or different events may resemble one another. And that's the source, I think, of the insistence of some people that no, they have to be the same event. I can just imagine centuries from now some clever scholar with partial information informing us that there was only ever one Jonathan Edwards. You can see how it could happen. You can see why somebody would say that. Now, just a remark or two here about proper historical approach. There is nothing wrong with assuming provisionally that two very similar accounts in different sources refer to the same event or person. This is often the simplest explanation. That's fine. I agree with that as a provisional step. But when otherwise reliable sources, and now you can see why we took all that time in the earlier lectures of this series working through the external and the internal historical evidence, the evidence of authorship, to establish that these sources are in fact reliable. When otherwise reliable sources close to the event also report different details or different settings, it's reasonable to ask whether the accounts might refer to two distinct events or persons rather than just getting it wrong about one and the same event or one and the same person. So to apply that to cleansing of the temple, it appears most reasonable, given what we know about the historical reliability of all four gospel authors, to say that Jesus chased the money changers and merchants out of the temple twice. After all, it's the same guy, Jesus. It's the same issue, the misuse of the temple. It's the same place. It's not unthinkable that he would do the same thing twice. The coincidences between the two accounts are striking, but they're less striking than the coincidences in the case of the two Jonathan Edwardses. And the differences in time are pretty clearly described in the Gospels. Since the Gospel authors have shown themselves to be historically reliable in other respects, they deserve the benefit of the doubt here. Again, if we hadn't done all that spade work, we wouldn't have a historical case to make. But we've already done that extensively for hours. Go to YouTube if you need it. There are other plausible instances of conflation. I won't insist on these in any detail. The location of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5 places it on a mountain. Luke 6 places it on a level place. Is it the same Is it the same one? I'm a teacher, and I reuse illustrations, jokes, quotations all the time. So if one person were to say he had heard me give a certain illustration or tell a certain story in a seminar classroom, and another person were to say he'd heard me do it at a coffee shop, they might both be right. In Greek and Roman biography, bioi, it was quite common to pull together material from a number of different chronological periods if it was thematically similar or had some other relevant similarity, and put it all in one place. That may also be what's going on in some of these passages. Again, the anointing of Jesus with perfume. We've got accounts in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 7, and John 12. Are they all the same event? There are some similarities among the stories. There also appear to be some differences as to setting. I think plausibly that could be a place where distinct events are being conflated because of some similarities. One more, though, the apotheosis of conflation. There are actually people who try to say that the story of the rich man and Lazarus, you remember that story? Okay? Is the basis for the story in John 11 of the resurrection of Lazarus. Because in both of them, there's a good man named Lazarus, and he dies. And there the similarities end. In fact, backing out, one of these is a parable, and one of them is presented as something that happens historically. So the idea, though, that on the basis of even the slenderest similarities, we can assume that these are intended to be the same story, or one of them is somehow a modification of the story. I have very little good to say about that method of treating any historical text. I think that is irresponsible, and that's the nicest of the things I will say about it. We can talk more about that if you want to hear more about it afterwards. Final one. In Matthew 27, we have an account of the death of Judas. Judas realizes he has betrayed an innocent man. He throws the 30 pieces of silver into the temple because the chief priests and scribes won't take them back. And he goes and he hangs himself. With the 30 pieces of silver, they're just kind of looking at the money and saying, well, we can't put it into the treasury because it's blood money. Let's buy a field with it. And so they go and they buy a field. But in Acts 1:18, again, I'll step out of the Gospels to allow the critic to set up a contradiction here. Judas acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, that's the wording, and then falling headlong, he burst open in the middle and all his bowels gushed out. Lovely picture. Memorable picture. If you wanted to know what happened to a traitor, you wouldn't forget that one. Dante is so impressed by Judas' treachery that he's got Judas at the very bottom level of hell. He's there with Brutus, who betrayed Caesar, right? To betray one to whom you have pledged your allegiance is the worst possible thing you can do. Curiously, last month, I had 3 different people ask me about this issue in the space of 1 week. So it is a pretty popular objection. What's going on there? Well, there are 2 difficulties in these passages. The first one is, how did Judas die? By hanging or by falling? And the second one is, who purchased the field? Judas himself or the chief priests? Let's tackle them in order. How did Judas die? Here's a clue. When a living person falls, even falls headlong, he does not generally burst open. I should know. Back in my youth, when I thought that I was immortal, I made a kind of a career out of falling headlong over the handlebars of my bike, off of my skateboard. I fell every which way, and I've got the scars to prove it. At no point did I burst open. At no point did my bowels gush out. I'm very grateful for this. But this would be what we would expect if 2 conditions were met. Number 1, that Judas was already dead when he fell. So it was his dead body that fell. And number 2, the body fell from some height. Because if it had already begun to rot, then it wouldn't have just the structural integrity of a living body, and we might expect that if it fell from some height, it might splash open. Now, people who visited the Holy Land have thought about this, and there are some cliffs overlooking the Valley of Hinnom, and along the edge there are a number of olive trees. And the cliffs fall pretty much sheer. They're almost perpendicular, and they range from 25 feet to 40 feet in height. So it's a pretty long fall. If Judas hanged himself off of one of the branches of the olive tree, which he might have done in order to ensure that he couldn't get back, because he really wanted to kill himself and didn't want to panic at the last moment, and his body then fell later from the tree, it would plausibly break open as it fell on the rocks below. It's not a nice soft fall. There's nothing padding it down there. There's not a whole lot of padding around in Israel on the whole. I find that plausible. I cannot prove it to you, but it puts together the 2 accounts we have from sources that are otherwise trustworthy. And no other interpretation is going to make it clear why Judas would have burst open when he fell headlong. That clue has to be respected. That's in the passage. We have to take that seriously. This explanation covers the facts. No other explanation really does. Okay, but that's only half the problem. Who purchased the field? So go back. Remember the case of the centurion. An action done by someone's authority or through his provision is considered to be his action. In fact, we even have in law a Latin maxim about this. Qui facit per alium, facit per se. He who does something, who acts through another, does the act himself. Well, you can see how this fits together in the case of Judas. The chief priests purchased the field with the money Judas had provided by throwing it back at them. That's why it's fair for Peter to say in Acts, as Luke quotes him saying, that Judas purchased a field with the reward of his wickedness. How? Through the agency of those to whom he provided the money for the action that was then done. So let's just summarize, go back over the 7 contradictions that we have looked at in this lecture. First of all, Matthew and Luke and the apparently conflicting genealogies. Conflation, I would argue, of 2 distinct genealogies. Second, dating problems with Matthew claiming Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, but Luke placing it more than a decade later. Carelessness in reading Luke, ignoring the fact that Luke has already told us about both of the time posts here, when the reign of Herod is, and the census. And I think some understandable confusion over the rather terse way that Luke has put the Greek together. Argument for that can be found in Lecture 4b online. Mary and Joseph, living already in Bethlehem when Jesus was born in a house. Careless reading, not in Matthew, and an assumption of completeness, Matthew doesn't mention the trip, but so what? Matthew's not telling you that he's giving you a comprehensive biography of Jesus from birth onward. Objection 4. Mark says Jesus had a disciple named Thaddeus. He doesn't list Judas. Luke lists Judas, but not Thaddeus. Just confusion. These are two names for the same person. Information about the cultural context, the fact that people had multiple names, helps us to understand what's really going on and shows us how probable this explanation is. Number 5, Matthew says the centurion came to Jesus himself. Luke says he sent messengers. Context, context, context. Matthew uses a common manner of speaking, a common figure of speech, ascribing to a person actions done at his bidding, on his behalf, or by his authority. Objection number 6. In the Synoptics, the cleansing of the temple comes at the end of Jesus' ministry. In John, it comes at the beginning. I think the most probable explanation is that there is conflation going on here. These are two distinct events. The objection, again, arises from the insistence on completeness. If Jesus had done this at the beginning, why don't the Synoptics tell about it? If he did it at the end, why doesn't John tell about it? But none of these works is even attempting to give us a complete list of the things Jesus did. Finally, how did Judas die? Geographical context provides us a plausible resolution of the two accounts of Judas' death at the edge of the Valley of Hinnom. Consideration of the same principle seen in the case of the centurion resolves the question of who purchased the field. So where does that leave us? Here's a preliminary conclusion. Preliminary, because we haven't finished looking at alleged contradictions in the gospel, not even major ones. So far, these alleged contradictions have not sustained the charge that the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory. People who want to make that charge have not made their case. Each of these objections can be answered either decisively or plausibly in a manner that reconciles the sources without straining. But we haven't yet looked at the death, burial, and resurrection accounts in the Gospels. Those will form the subject of the next lecture. If you want more, there are two places that I would urge you to go. One of them is Apologetics 3:15, run by my good friend Brian Auten, who is actually in Michigan for just a couple of more days, but he'll be leaving at the end of this week to head back to Ireland with his wife and children. Brian is the one who takes these, transcribes them, or rather takes the audio and polishes it up and puts it all in place together with a video of the slides and puts them up on YouTube. You can also go to the Library of Historical Apologetics. The URL for that is also on your handout, and there you will find some historically valuable sources pertaining to some of this material. Thank you very much. I would love to take some questions now. If you've got some questions or comments that you want to raise. John, you were about to say something earlier. You want to go ahead with that? Okay, so the question is, as far as things being done through the agency by the request or on behalf of people, is the case of the mother of James and John, the sons of thunder, the sons of Zebedee, is that a case of her acting on their behalf, and then in other accounts it's being said that they came and asked Jesus? And the answer is it might be. I don't know, but it would not be terribly implausible because that figure is used widely in Scripture. And that may be, so if somebody tries to raise that as a contradiction, that's one possible response. And the other possible response is both may be true. Just as with the centurion, it's possible that he sent people on ahead and then sort of came along himself afterwards, but it's also possible that he didn't. I think the better reading of the text is that he didn't, for reasons I won't go into just now. But if you read him yourself, you can make up your own mind on that. But yeah, that may be another instance of the same thing.
You mentioned Josephus mentioned in his writings that he gave his own genealogy, the public records.
How far back does Josephus' genealogy go? I think he goes back to David, and he may go back further. I'll have to double check that. But he goes back a good ways. It's a good set of generations back. So he goes back quite some distance. It's not at all implausible that what he is giving there is parallel to the kinds of records that would have been available to Matthew and to Luke before the destruction of Jerusalem. Afterwards, if you were lucky, you had a copy made of your family's ancestry. If not, you're out of luck. Jerusalem's destroyed. It's all gone with it. Any other questions? Pastor?
When you have these sophisticated ways of understanding the alleged contradictions and somebody accuses you of not taking the Bible literally, do you have another word that you might use for that kind of naive reading of it?
Right. So the question is, there's a certain kind of naive reading that would view some of the resolutions of these apparent contradictions as not taking the Bible literally. And what would my response be? And my response would be that the only fair way to understand Scripture and the books of Scripture and the Gospels here we're concerned with in particular is to look at them in terms of the kind of literature that they are and the circumstances in which they were written. And to take them seriously that way requires that we not import assumptions that may seem fine to us, but would not have been understood by them. There's a really good book called What Are the Gospels? A comparison with Greco-Roman biography. It's written by Richard Burridge. He pretty nearly single-handedly killed the old-fashioned Boltzmannian insistence that the Gospels were, in some significant sense, mythic documents. And that argument had in part been based on alleged contradictions or errors in their handling of material. And what Burridge showed was, if you read Plutarch's Lives, if you read Dio Cassius, if you read Suetonius, if you read these biographers who deal in Greek and in Latin with noble Greeks and Romans, read the biographies, you discover that the genre of the Gospels is identifiably the same as the genre of these things. And then certain characteristics of that genre come out, such as, for example, topical or thematic arrangement of material. If somebody said a number of notable things, you might get them all together in one passage, even though, as we read some of the other biographers, we find that he said this early in life, and he said that on his deathbed, and he said this other thing somewhere else in time and space, pulling them all together. Why? Because they're all about the same topic. And then, when you look at, let's say, the Olivet Discourse, some of the eschatological discourses of Jesus, you realize that as far as the conventions of that time were concerned, it was good history to put a whole bunch of apocalyptic stuff Jesus had really said all in one place. And that's not a violation of accuracy. That was a standard of accuracy widely accepted at that time. If we insist on reading the Gospels with standards in view that were not the standards of the people who were writing or reading them at the time, we are asking for trouble. And we can find it. If you're looking for trouble, you'll find it. But if we're careful and we do our homework about the historical background of these things, then we are not apt to be blindsided by these kinds of things. And we can help to explain to people what the conventions were, what the restrictions on these things were, how far, how much flexibility did they feel they had with that material, and what were the limits of that flexibility. And it turns out that by looking at Greco-Roman biography, we can get a pretty good grip on that. So I guess for someone who comes with a sort of rigidity you're describing, maybe saying, here's a nice, fat, scholarly book, go and read it. That might not get me very far, but I'm a professor, and that's what I tell people to do anyway. So.
Do you tend to steer clear of the word literal then?
No, not at all. I think that there are plenty of things that are literal in a very straightforward way. But, when somebody says Jesus said such and such, gives something that Jesus said. If he was speaking in Aramaic, what we have is a Greek rendering of his words anyway, except in very few cases like Talitha Kumi or Epapha or things like that are rendered for us into Aramaic. But for the most part, we're getting a Greek version of it, and I believe that it is a faithful representation of what Jesus said, in the sense that one of you might come up to me right after this talk and say, so if I'm understanding you correctly, is this what you're saying? And you might give some summary of some point that I've made. And you might not use 5 consecutive words exactly the same that I gave them in the same order, and yet you might so faithfully represent what I said that I would say to you face to face tonight right here, yes, that's it. That's exactly what I'm saying. So if we understand this by the norms and the conventions of that time, then I think we can dispense with a lot of things that are really, they're non-issues, they're non-contradictions masquerading as contradictions for people who are importing their own assumptions into the inquiry instead of looking at this in a historically responsible way. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh to those people, but that's what I would say. Yeah?
A lot of people think, how can somebody have written down everything that Jesus said? I mean, it's so much and goes on for pages. How can that be real? How would you respond?
Okay, so the question is, how could disciples of Jesus have kept in mind so many things that he said and gotten them all? I mean, look at the Sermon on the Mount. It's hard just to sit down and memorize 3 chapters of Jesus. It's great stuff, right? But you've got all kinds of topics. He's moving from one thing to another. How could they have memorized all of that? Part of my answer is that there's a cultural difference between us and them. The students of a Jewish rabbi were, in the words of one Jewish source, to be like a well-plastered cistern, like a jug, that would not lose a single drop of what you put into it. They were expected to train their memories. And there were techniques for memory training, techniques that were known all across the ancient world. In fact, some of those techniques had been developed back centuries earlier in Greek times. And using those techniques, even someone today who wants to can give a pretty faithful account of several hours of discussion. It takes work. It's work we're not inclined to do because we have recorders. So we don't need to, right? Instead of using the part of our brain that would be committing to memory in a very faithful way, large amounts of material as it happens, we just record it and then don't worry about it. In that respect, we're kind of lazy. Some of you may be old enough to remember Alex Haley's Roots, which was a special that was made into a television special and spanned many episodes. Do you remember the bit where the central character has gone back to Africa to find out about his ancestry? And he finds one of these guys who has the memory of the whole history of the tribe. But he can't just jump into the middle of it. He has to begin chanting it from the beginning. And it goes on and on. And it's wearying. The guy's falling asleep. And finally he hears, I can't remember the exact words, it's something like, Kunta Kunta went down to the shore to make a drum. That's it. This guy's got it all memorized. He's got it memorized for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, none of the things Jesus says are that long. You can read aloud the Sermon on the Mount, one of the longest sustained, connected passages of Jesus' words, in 20 minutes or so. It just doesn't take that long to sit down and read it aloud. The other thing I want to say, besides the cultural difference and the fact that in Jewish culture it was very common to try to fasten on this, is that many of these things Jesus said in front of a lot of different people and probably said more than once. So if you were trying to remember what Jesus had said, you had 2 other helpful things. Number one, if he said something and you thought it was really cool and you couldn't remember quite what it was, hang around. You know, if you're following this guy around for 3 years, he's probably going to say something like that again. And so you get a second chance to reinforce it. And the other thing is, if you can't remember it, turn to Peter and ask him what Jesus said. Maybe he'll remember that bit better than you did, and you can put it together. So there are also ways that groups of people listening to a teacher who teaches similar lessons in multiple places and situations can get their memory reinforced. Is that a fair answer to your question?
Yep.
Great. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for your attention.